Hello everyone, my name's Bhante Akāliko. My pronouns are he and him. I'm a queer, Theravadan Buddhist monk. I'm also the founder of Rainbodhi LGBTQIA Buddhist Community. That means lesbians, gays, bisexuals, trans people and non-binary people, queer people, intersex people, and asexual people, and any other combination. Today I'm going to be talking a little bit about my work with Rainbodhi, as well as why we need to include queer, trans and intersex people in our Buddhist communities. I'll be looking at some of the barriers that currently exclude them and offering some practical tips of how we can better include the LGBTQIA+ community within our Buddhist spaces. So firstly, I'd like to talk a little bit about Rainbodhi. Rainbodhi is a spiritual friendship group. We offer Dharma, meditation and social events in a safe and supportive environment. We also provide advocacy for LGBTQIA Buddhists within the broader Buddhist community and interfaith communities. Rainbodhi is non-sectarian. We welcome everyone regardless of gender, sexual orientation, race, religion or ability. All Rainbodhi events are free, and we try to make our events as accessible as we can to make sure that Rainbodhi is as inclusive as possible. Rainbodhi was established in 2019, around the time Australia was going through a particularly damaging debate about religious freedom and the ability for religious organisations to discriminate against many groups in society, including those people who are LGBTQIA+. And for me it was a very sad thing that in the history of religion, queer people, trans people, intersex people, those who don't fit into the straight, cisgendered paradigm, are often asked to make a choice between their identities that are innate to them as being human and their religion. So this is something that really troubled me, that we're being asked to make this choice, and it's an unfair choice. And for me, this is a choice that people should never be asked to make. Ever since there's been humans, there's been queer, trans and intersex people. And those people are spiritual people. They have as much right as anyone else to access a spiritual tradition. Buddhism has a queer, trans and intersex history. And this is important for us to know. Sometimes being queer, trans or intersex in a Buddhist community, we might not feel that we belong to a greater spiritual tradition. We might have some remnants left over about other religious attitudes towards us. Because so often our stories remain unacknowledged, unmentioned, unrecorded, or hidden away, censored and deleted from history. When we look over the history of Buddhism, we find in the margins, in the peripheries, some stories, some little remarks that indicate that yes, there were queer, trans and intersex Buddhists throughout the history of Buddhism. We know that the Buddha and the monks mentioned same-sex attraction. We understand that there was a group of people who perhaps took the role of a third gender. And we know that there was people with what we would call today intersex characteristics. And throughout the history of Buddhism, there's been lay people, monks, nuns, teachers and scholars who have been queer, trans and intersex. And it's important that our community has pride in these people and celebrates the diversity of the Buddhist community. And it's important that people who are queer can relate to a bigger picture, can feel that they belong to something, a spiritual tradition that is bigger than them. And so often you might be the only gay in the Sangha, or the only intersex person in your Buddhist community, or the only trans person going to the monastery. But I want you to know that you're part of a much bigger spiritual lineage of queer, trans and intersex people, and that you belong. It's true that Buddhism has a slightly better reputation than some other religions when it comes to queer people. But we can still experience some rejection and silencing in our Buddhist communities. And it's important to listen to the experience of LGBTQIA+ Buddhists so that we can understand what their experience actually is. It's very easy to say, oh, Buddhism welcomes queer people. But if it's just welcoming, sure, that's a great intention. Sure, that's a great mind state to have. It's certainly better than telling people that they're going to hell. But that's a pretty low bar. So when it comes to welcoming Buddhists, it's important to listen to the voices of Buddhists to find out how they experience their Buddhist community. Recently, Rainbodhi sponsored some research with Dr. Stephen Carey from Charles Darwin University, looking at the experiences of Australian queer, trans and intersex Buddhists. The results haven't yet been published and the research is ongoing, but initial results were quite surprising. They showed that perhaps our Buddhist communities aren't as welcoming or inclusive as we might like to believe. Almost 60% of Buddhists who are queer felt that their Buddhist community, at least some of the time, silences or ignores LGBTQIA+ issues. 55% were reluctant at some time to disclose their identity within their Buddhist communities. That means they weren't comfortable feeling out. 53% of respondents said that they'd experienced or seen sexism within their Buddhist communities. 35% said that they'd seen or experienced homophobia. 25% said that they'd experienced transphobia or misgendering. And alarmingly, 20% of respondents said that they had been told that their identity was incompatible with Buddhist teachings. These results were saddening to me because it showed that over half our community weren't comfortable being themselves in Buddhist spaces. And worse, that forms of abuse like homophobia, transphobia, misogyny were still very much present within our communities. And so this is why Rainbodhi exists, to be a voice within the larger Buddhist community, to advocate for more inclusion, and importantly, to provide support for LGBTQIA+ Buddhists who might be isolated or feeling unwelcome, unsure if they belong on the Buddhist path. So, how can you help? One way that individuals and organisations can be better friends to LGBTQIA+ people is firstly just to remember that not everyone is straight and not everyone is cisgendered. That means acknowledging that queer, trans and intersex people attend retreats, they go to temples, they go visit monasteries. This might sound pretty basic, but often queer, trans and intersex people feel like they just don't exist within Buddhist communities, that their experiences are something private, something to be kept quiet or secret, and that their identities, which are so important outside of Buddhist communities, are something that they shouldn't talk about within. However, this means that many people's experience of Buddhist communities might be less than a positive one. It might mean that those people are not having their needs met. And so one thing that individuals and organisations can do is to be proactive in promoting inclusion and pride within their Buddhist community. So when it comes to inclusion, it's very important, firstly, to acknowledge the existence of queer, trans and intersex people within our communities, and secondly, to make them feel welcome. This is just basic goodwill, loving kindness, welcoming others. However, just saying that your Buddhist organisation, retreat centre or monastery is LGBTQI friendly without actually making any changes is just mere tokenism. If we're going to be truly inclusive, then there has to be some changes made to our organisations to remove the barriers that currently exclude. It might be difficult for us to understand that there are barriers that exclude. Maybe an analogy could be a person in a wheelchair confronted with steps. The steps, of course, are a barrier to their full participation. And so instead now we have lifts and ramps to make sure that people can fully participate. And in the same way, there's barriers that exclude queer, trans and intersex people from participating fully in Buddhist organisations. And this may come as a surprise to many people. But that's what it means to have privilege. This means to not see. True inclusion means understanding the perspectives of LGBTQIA+ people. It means listening to their experiences. Understanding that there are things that exclude and harm, and making changes to remove those things that harm. So this might mean making some changes to administrative practices or physical changes to the architecture and space of your Buddhist centre. It might mean making some new policies within your organisation. And for individuals, it might mean just becoming more aware of the language that you use to and around LGBTQIA+ people. And so unless Buddhist individuals and organisations are actively including the LGBTQIA+ community, then trans, intersex and queer Buddhists will continue to feel excluded and that they don't belong. And so I encourage Buddhist individuals and Buddhist organisations to consciously become a better spiritual friend to the LGBTQIA+ Buddhist community. And that means becoming an ally. An ally is someone who's maybe straight or cisgendered, who doesn't experience the same things that the LGBTQIA+ Buddhist community does, but advocates on their behalf. Allies help do the work of explaining the issues that affect queer, trans and intersex people. Because this work is emotional labour, and it's really hard sometimes for the people who experience prejudice and discrimination to do this work alone. And so if you're going to be an ally to queer, trans and intersex people, then it's very important to firstly listen to the experiences of those people, and secondly to educate yourself. So this might mean knowing what all the letters in the Rainbow acronym mean. It might mean understanding the difference between gender and sexuality. It might mean recognising that the experience of queer people is quite different to the experience of trans or intersex people. So it means that if we're going to advocate on behalf of someone, we need to know what we're doing, we need to know what we're talking about. And we need to understand that the voices of those people should be placed at the centre of our advocacy. Another thing that we can do is to celebrate diversity and celebrate pride. Celebrating diversity is an opportunity for mudita, for empathetic joy, celebrating the happiness of others. So you or your organisation could undertake pride and diversity training to find out how to make your organisation more inclusive and encourage other organisations to do the same. You can put up posters or stickers to let your community know that you support inclusion for LGBTQIA+ people. And include a safe space rainbow on your website or on your publicity materials. At talks and events, you can mention that your community welcomes queer, trans and intersex people. You could have a Pride Month event within your community. You can invite queer, trans and intersex people to participate at all levels of your organisation. In administration, in the kitchen, volunteering in the monastery, or sitting on boards. And you can invite a queer, trans or intersex person to be the diversity officer of your organisation. And you can have publicly available safeguarding processes that allow people to raise issues and concerns, especially about things like homophobia, transphobia within your organisation, and ensure that there'll be a follow-up and a resolution. And this is an essential part of creating a safe space. If you say that your community is a safe space for LGBTQIA+ people, but you don't do anything when there's homophobia or transphobia, then it's just lip service. So we need these policies in place to make sure that those people who you welcome into the space are cared for whilst they're there. One other thing to be aware of in your communities is where the intersections occur between things like race, sexuality, gender, wealth, education, and location. So these intersections are often overlapping areas of identity. And they're spaces where we might have some privilege or perhaps experience some discrimination in addition to those aspects of our identity. So the experience of a black trans woman in a Buddhist organisation is going to be quite different to that of a cis white woman, for example. So we need to be aware of these things in our organisations. Understanding the differences of experience is important because we need to recognise where these privileges and discriminations are occurring within ourselves and within our organisation so that we can address them to promote equality and inclusion for all. And lastly, I'd like to say a few words about the Buddhist doctrine of anatta, or not-self. Often LGBTQIA people are unfairly accused of being obsessed with their identity or clinging to an aspect of self, because we talk about our experiences as queer, trans or intersex Buddhists. We talk about our lives in a way that references our identity. Some people point to the doctrine of anatta and suggest that these identities don't exist, that they're illusory, or that they don't matter. Some people say that focusing on an identity is contrary to the Buddhist teachings. However, it's very important to understand that being queer, trans, or intersex is a fundamental part of being human. Suggesting that these aspects of a person's experience are illusory or unreal or simply don't matter is a misuse and a misunderstanding of this doctrine. Because this denies the very real experiences that LGBTQIA+ people have that define their lives. It omits the important differences that we experience it erases fundamental parts of our identity. It also minimises and trivialises the very real prejudice, discrimination and violence experienced by queer, trans and intersex people. It also means that positive aspects of people's lives, like their relationships, families, social activities and other things, are unimportant and invisible. And this means that queer, trans and intersex people might not feel comfortable expressing themselves in Buddhist spaces. And so it's important for us to think about how we talk about not-self and identity. Otherwise, a tool for personal growth can become a weapon that harms others. And this weaponized not-self is something that feels like another unfair attack on the LGBTQIA+ community. Often Buddhists will use the doctrine of not-self to shut down uncomfortable conversations about the things that impact on LGBTQIA+ people's lives, like forms that don't have a gender option, or accommodation options that are binary, or the segregation of sexes in retreat centres, or homophobia or transphobia that occurs in our Buddhist organisations. It's very easy to shut down these conversations, which need to be had, by simply saying there's no such thing as a self. Some Buddhists use not-self as a way of saying this is why you're suffering, because you're attached to this LGBTQIA+ identity. However, being queer of itself is not a form of suffering or a cause of suffering, not any more than being straight or cisgendered is. Usually, it's the attitude of other people towards LGBTQIA+ people that is what causes harm. It would be wonderful if the world was a place where gender identity, sexuality or intersex status simply didn't matter, but the world isn't there yet. So it's important for us to keep on having these conversations to see where we can do a better job of removing discrimination, prejudice and violence. We know that most LGBTQIA+ people have a balanced, healthy life. However, they are usually subject to discrimination and prejudice. We know that there's higher suicide rates for trans people and intersex people, higher rates of mental illness and depression, anxiety amongst people who are LGBTQIA+, usually because of the effects of prejudice, discrimination, stigma and violence. It would be easy to say that there's no such thing as a gender identity or sexuality, but the reality is that around the world, many countries make being queer illegal. Some countries impose the death penalty. Many countries make being trans illegal. Many countries have layers of discrimination that affect trans people. In many countries around the world, people who are intersex face genital mutilation and surgeries without their consent at a young age. These are the kinds of things that are real and that affect people who are LGBTQIA+. These are the kinds of things that are still going to affect people regardless of how you perceive this doctrine of not-self. And I would challenge those people who weaponize not-self against the LGBTQIA+ community to have a really long look at themselves. So if you're a person who believes that there's no such thing as a gender identity or sexuality, just think, every time you tick a box for Mr. or Ms., do you tick the same one every time? Or if someone was to misgender you, would you correct them? Would you be upset if someone used the wrong name? And how would you feel if your relationship was criminalized by the state, or that you could lose your job because of your sexuality? And so please be aware when you're talking about NotSelf that you don't turn this useful tool into a weapon that hurts others. So not only does Buddhism have a queer history, it also has a queer future as well. There's currently many queer, trans and intersex Buddhists contributing to the flourishing of Dharma around the world. And as society becomes increasingly more accepting and welcoming of LGBTQIA plus people, now's the time for Buddhist organisations to be more inclusive and change in meaningful ways to be welcoming places for queer, trans and intersex people. If you'd like to know more about the work that Rainbodhi does, please visit our website, rainbodhi.org.